And so here we are, this episode that instead of just relating the stories of history and myths and legends about the Chinese people, I'm going to do some conjecture and theorizing of my own, because I felt there's just too many questions surrounding this series of events. So yeah, note that this episode is not about, academics or stuff like that. And I have never once claimed to be an academic. I'm just someone who's interested in Chinese history and thought that, these are great stories to share with everyone. So if I make any mistakes, if I got my facts wrong, feel free to comment in the comment section and tell me what you think. So yeah, what's this about? Well, basically, as I mentioned in the previous couple of episodes, one very big question that baffled many of us who were interested in the events surrounding the transition from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty, this series of events, this period around the military rally at Meng Jin or Meng Jin Guanbing to the eventual demise of the Shang dynasty after the Battle of Muye or Muye Zhizhan. Now, there's a lot of question marks, a lot of things, a lot of points that don't really make a lot of logical sense. So in this episode, I would try to theorize and come to some conjecture of my own part based on a rereading of some of the source materials and see if there was anything that was missed. And of course, we'll also take a look at some of the newer source material that has been discovered and transcribed within the last 10 to 20 years. So yeah, hope you enjoy this video. Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Apingo. I am that Chinese history guy. Here we share the myths, legends and histories of the Chinese people from the first creator to the last imperial dynasty. More than 6,000 years of stories. One video at a time. And if you like content like this, you like stories like this, don't forget to give us a like, a sub, a comment on the video and share it with everybody you know. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there were some pretty big questions and some logical gymnastics that you have to do to come to terms with the series of events that told the story of about the transition between the Zhou and the Shang and the Zhou dynasty. So some of the questions was, why would the Zhou allies expend this astronomical amount of resources to rally 100,000 fighting men just for a ceremony? And then after that, shouting a few slogans, they return back to their respective homes and then march out all over again about, 1.5, 2 years later for the actual military campaign. Basically they're doing the same thing 2 times, expending, ridiculous amounts of resources. It doesn't make sense. At least to me, it doesn't make sense, even as a Chinese person, Now, this was a historical mystery, with as many theories and answers as there are, historians and scholars who have their own interpretations of these ancient texts that covered the events. And one thing that I need to point out that we all need to note is that these early historians, the way early history is written during that time did not conform to what we would now understand as stringent academic standards. Most of these accounts of the time were written as part myth, part legend, and part records, documentation of events. And many of these accounts were actually affected by the political or the ideological lenses of the writers and the scholars of the time. So we need some context. Now, for context, it's very important to understand that Confucians, the Confucian scholars, who basically are the mainstream scholars, the mainstream academics of China for the past few thousand years, even until very recent history. Confucians regard the Zhou Dynasty as the golden age and the ideal form of Chinese civilization. And as such, its founders, the founders of the Zhou Dynasty, King Wen and King Wu, Zhou Wen Wang, Zhou Wu Wang, would have to be paragons of virtue and benevolence to fit in with this Confucian worldview and their narrative. And as an example of this, when Mencius Meng Jin, who was considered to be the second greatest Confucian master after Confucius himself, when Mencius read about the amount of bloodshed after the Battle of Muye, and this was an account that was recorded in Book of Documents in Shang. When Mencius read this account, he commented, "To believe fully in the Book of Documents, I would rather there be no Book of Documents regarding the chapter Wu Cheng." Well, I would agree with only 2 or 3 points. The virtuous and the benevolent are invincible amongst men. So for the utmost virtuous King Wu to vanquish the utmost sinful tyrant King Zhou, it is inconceivable that so much bloodshed would have happened. So yeah, even Mencius, a highly regarded thinker and philosopher of the time, would say something like this because it went against his beliefs. And what I'm going to say next might trigger quite a few people, especially the traditionalists. I'm sorry. The grand historian Sima Qian, well, he is a highly respected historian, but he is also a highly respected Confucian scholar. Not taking anything away from him, I mean, credit where credit is due. Most of our understanding of early Chinese history is thanks to his relentless work in researching and compiling all these ancient texts of the pre-Qin dynasty era, and to compile them into a comprehensive or cohesive compendium of events that stretch thousands of years before his birth. So the records of the grand historian Shi Ji. Now, this is a very, very important book in terms of trying to understand early Chinese history, and it does a very great job of that. But at the same time, we have to read his writings with certain clarity of mind, because there are also many instances of his interpretations of early events, these early source documents, being colored by his own ideological beliefs, and there were even some cases of wholesale whitewashing of characters and events to suit the Confucian narrative and the Confucian worldview. For example, go look up this old document called the Bamboo Annals, and compare the writings in the Bamboo Annals, compare the description of events in the Bamboo Annals to descriptions of same events in the records of the grand historians, and you will see some really glaring inconsistencies. So with all this context and this idea behind why I'm making this video, with all that context in mind, and together with rereading the source texts like Book of Documents, the classical poetries, and Bamboo Annals, of course, and more recent discoveries of ancient documents like this Qinghua bamboo slips, which I believe was rediscovered in 2008. Certain parts of it has been transcribed, and the transcription work and the deciphering work is still ongoing. So with all these things in mind, we can make some conjectures and some theorizing to try to come to a more logical interpretation of the events surrounding the final demise of the Shang dynasty, specifically, events from the military rally at Meng Jin to the Battle of Muye. Now, regarding this entire series of events, there are a few major questions and of course many other small niggling questions that challenge my logical thinking process. And number one, was the Shang court so blind to the ambitions of the Zhou people, to their growth? I mean, knowing that they already had some conflicts and the Zhou people obviously has a blood feud to settle with the Shang, were they so blind to their ambitions and to their growth that they did nothing to kind of keep it in check? Number two, is it logical by any stretch of the imagination to mobilize about 100,000 men or maybe even more just for a ceremony at this bank, at this place, at this bank of the Yellow River, shout a few slogans, make a few speeches, and then all go back home, and then less than 2 years later do the same thing over again for the actual military campaign? Is that logical? Is it possible? Number three, is it logical and possible for 50,000 fighting men to crush an army of 700,000 in a single day? And yeah, I guess technically that is a possibility with certain caveats thrown in, but is that really possible? And to accomplish it within a day or maybe half a day, is that possible? So these are three major points that I would address in this video. Okay, now let's get on with it. Now, the following rest of the video will be purely my own conjecture and theorizing based on what I read and found so far with regards to these events. Now, first and foremost, my personal opinion is that the entire period from the military rally at Meng Jin all the way until the end of the Battle of Muye was actually one single long extended campaign, rather than two separate events that took place roughly 2 years apart, as narrated by the Grand Historian Sima Qian. Now, I have an explanation for my theory and my conjecture, okay? So, based on what we know from various ancient sources, the final 16 years of Shang rule under the tyrant or King Zhou were filled with conflicts with the Dongyi people to the east. And apart from these border skirmishes and uprisings and rebellions, there were at least 3 instances of King Zhou, the tyrant, raising the military might of the entire kingdom on major campaigns against the Dongyi people. 3 major campaigns were raised. The strategic objective of these major campaigns was actually to annihilate the Dongyi people and wipe them out off the face of the earth once and for all, sort them out once and for all. Now, however, while these campaigns achieve a certain level of successes in ensuring that the Dongyi people would never be able to amass enough strength and resources to march into the heartlands of the Shang kingdom to overtake the Shang people as the new overlords of the land, it failed, in the strategic objective of getting rid of this threat to the east, once and for all. And this strategic failure, resulted in a chain of events that would snowball over time, over the next, decade, into bigger and bigger problems for the Shang court. Now, firstly, the severe depletion of resources and manpower and strength within the Shang kingdom due to these unrelenting military campaigns yeah, it's very expensive to fight wars if you haven't realized by now. So this severe depletion of resources and strength and manpower means that, just to keep up with their day-to-day running, they would have to implement heavier and heavier taxes and more and more demanding conscription terms on their own people, on the populace of the Shang people. And all this, basically did not mean that they were expanding. Basically, they had to do this just to keep the kingdom running on a day-to-day basis. And this added greatly to the suffering and, of course, the anger of the populace. And this failure on the eastern front to wipe out the Tongyi people also put the Shang kingdom in a situation where they had to station a permanent garrison in the east to deal with this perpetual threat. I mean, granted, they are not going to be strong enough to overrun the Shang kingdom by this time, but they are still a very, very irritating and annoying problem, that the Shang people just could not ignore and let them be. So yeah, a permanent garrison of some of the best fighting forces of the Shang kingdom had to be stationed in the east to take care of them. Now, with this core of the Shang military permanently stationed in the east, they neither had the resources nor the ability to pay attention to the growing Zhou people to their west. Practically in their backyard, they were less than 1,000 kilometers away. In fact, just 300, 400 kilometers away, the Zhou capital to the Shang capital. Yeah, that was a problem. And, with this context in mind, with this situation in mind, we can logically deduce and logically say that the Shang court was not blind to the ambitions and the growth of the Zhou people. They just did not have the ability and the capacity to actually do anything about it. Now, another possible reason that the Shang did not take any drastic actions against the Zhou at this time was that while the Zhou had revealed some of their ambitions and they have their conflicts and of course they have their feuds, they were still technically vassals of the Shang court until very recently. At the time, King Wen did not declare himself a king until the last, if I'm not wrong, the last final 5 years of his rule. And so they were technically vassals until very recently, and they had more importantly, they had never really openly challenged the legitimacy of Shang rule. On the other hand, the Tongyi people were considered a foreign people with different cultures, different traditions, different worship rituals, and all of that. And they had been in open conflict with the Shang for as long as anyone could remember. It's like stretching generations, back to the early kings of the Shang dynasty. They had been in open conflict with the Tongyi people. So the Shang court most probably, this is me theorizing, most probably felt that they had enough time to deal with the foreign threat first before, turning back to do a bit of housekeeping, regarding the Zhou people in their own backyard. And this strategic priority would prove to become extremely costly to the Shang kingdom, very soon. Now, to the actual events in question that has, really gave me a lot of sleepless nights, to be honest. So these events, how I think they actually played out based on my interpretation of the original old texts and the new information that we found. Why do I say that the military rally at Meng Jin and the Battle of Muye was actually one long extended campaign instead of two separate events? Now, for one, I've mentioned this many times, it makes no bloody logical sense to mobilize so many people for a simple ceremony, shout some slogans, give some speeches, and then turn back. The cost would have been prohibitive, especially in those times. I mean, it would have been prohibitive even in in the sense of modern days, but it would have been even more so back in those days, and it would have accomplished nothing more strategically and tactically, it would have accomplished nothing apart from sending an extremely loud warning to the Shang court to turn their attention back west, sooner than they had. Yeah, so it doesn't make sense to me. And a second more important clue could be found in the recently discovered Qinghua bamboo slips, Qinghua Zhu Jian. Now, in this ancient text discovered around 2008, there was this chapter that has now been transcribed called Qi Ye, which actually narrates an event that was previously attributed to King Wen or Wen Wang by the grand historian himself, no less. And that would have put the event like at least 6 to 10 years before it actually happened. Now, in this chapter, this is what it said. In the 8th year of King Wu's reign, the state of Li was invaded and great victory was had. Upon returning, a celebration was held in the shrine of King Wen. In attendance were King Wu himself, Duke of Zhou, the Duke of Bi, the Duke of Shao, Xin Jia, and the Grand Tutor Jiang Shang, amongst many others. Alcohol was drank and poetry was written to commemorate this victory. Now, from this passage, we would know for a fact that the invasion of the state of Li definitely happened after King Wen passed away, and it was during King Wu's reign. And in fact, within this chapter were 3 pieces or 4 pieces of poems that were written by the attendees of this celebration regarding the victory at Li. Now, why is this important? Okay, the state of Li was a state of great strategic importance to the Shang kingdom. It was a city-state ruled by a sub-line of the Shang royal family, and it lies just about 150 kilometers to the west of the Shang capital Zhaoge. It was said to be densely populated with a sizable military garrison that acted as a strategic defensive shield for the Shang capital. And according to the classic of poetry or Shi Jing, the fall of the city-state was actually accompanied by the near-complete massacre of its entire population. And this was actually an important piece of information for understanding the series of events that will follow, and it will make sense of how things most probably played out. Rather than 2 separate events, why is most probably one single event? Now that we have established the importance of the state of Li to the Shang kingdom, we can understand why the series of events recorded by the grand historian would not make sense. I mean, if King Wen was to really just attack Li, invade Li, and then pull back, doesn't make sense, because the Shang court would not ignore it. They won't allow a challenger to the legitimacy of their claim to hang around just with a dagger right next to the heart of their kingdom. It doesn't make sense. An immediate retaliation and most probably even a full-scale invasion of the Zhou lands would be more than a likely outcome, considering that during King Wen's time, the Zhou was still not as strong, and the Shang still had enough support among the vassals to do that, to destroy them. So yeah, it doesn't make sense. So yeah, and now we have definite proof that the invasion of Li happened in the 8th year of King Wu's reign. Now, by the grand historian's own account, the military rally at Meng Jin took place in the 9th year of King Wu's reign, and then the Battle of Muye happened sometime about 2 years later, in the 11th year of his reign. Now, next we have to understand the distance between Meng Jin, the Shang capital Zhaoge, and this state of Li were actually roughly similar. They were, about 150 kilometers to each other, like an equilateral triangle. So 150 kilometers between each point. The only difference being the route between Zhao Ge and Li was mostly harsh terrain, while the route between Meng Jin and Zhao Ge was basically 150 kilometers of open plains, which was extremely conducive to moving a large number of fighting men, moving an entire military across, so at a very fast pace. So yeah, that is the spatial relationship between these three places. So strategically and tactically speaking, if the Zhou troops were camped out at Meng Jin and they were to attack the Shang capital directly, the troops from Li could easily march out and cut off their retreat, or they could march out directly to reinforce the capital's defense to protect it, and they could fight off the Zhou forces. But the question is, if the Zhou forces decide to attack Li first before taking the capital, the Shang court will have a very big headache on their hands. They will have to make a very difficult choice. They could either march out from the capital through harsh terrain to reinforce Li, while leaving the southern route open for the Zhou allied forces to sweep through and take the capital. Or they could sweep down south and take the Zhou camp at Meng Jin, but in the process they would lose their shield in the state of Li anyways. So this was a very big strategic dilemma that the Shang court was facing, and it's not an easy choice to make. I mean, the only way the Shang could achieve a total strategic success in this scenario would be to have two well-armed, well-equipped armies march towards both the state of Li and Meng Jin and take out these two enemy forces at the same time. However, if that was to happen, if the Zhou allied forces realize the Shang have enough military might to mount this kind of counter-offensive, they could simply just recross the Yellow River back towards the south and the west and wait for a better opportunity. So yeah, strategically the Zhou people had all the advantages in this scenario, and based on our understanding of the situation of the Shang kingdom at that time, which we touched on earlier, they simply did not have the resources nor the manpower to bring two fully equipped armies out to meet this challenge. Now, assuming small margin of error between the timelines recorded in the records of the Grand Historian and the Tsinghua Bamboo Strips, the following is my own opinion and my own theory and conjecture of the events around the final conquest of the Shang. Now, don't use this video as your textbook or whatever for schoolwork, because this is just purely my theory, okay? This is not accepted or recorded history, okay? Keep that in mind. Okay, this is my theory. What happened in my mind is that King Wu, Zhou Wu Wang, rallied his allies and troops at Meng Jin around 1048 BCE, between the 8 and 9 years of his reign. He rallied the troops. The rally at Meng Jin did happen. However, what happened was not just a ceremony and the shouting of some slogans. What happened at the rally at Meng Jin was that the Zhou allied forces launched a surprise invasion of the state of Li, with part of the forces camped out at Meng Jin, in reserve. And the Shang court at this time, with its limited manpower and resources, were not able to react to this sudden development, on their western front, Now, the resulting successful invasion of and massacre of the state of Li will most probably have exceeded the wildest expectations of King Wu. Whatever expectations he had of this campaign, he would have expected at least some kind of reaction by the Shang court. What he did not expect was that the Shang court was so depleted and so weak at this time that they could not even mount any form of retaliation or any form of reinforcement or any reaction at all to both his troops camped out at Meng Jin and the invasion force at Li. And this was like a situation that most probably caught everyone by surprise. And, with this sudden turn of events, which, let's face it, is really advantageous to King Wu, they decided that, okay, now we have a bit of time on our hands. So he took his senior lords and some of his allies and senior commanding officers. They returned to the Zhou capital to celebrate and to conduct, ceremonies, victory ceremonies, and some worship, to thank their blessings, most probably. While these troops remain camped out at Meng Jin to regroup and await further reinforcements from, most probably new allies that were finally persuaded by this victory at Li to join up with them. And that is where we get the events documented in the Qinghua bamboo strips regarding this victory celebration and ceremony in the shrine of King Wen. Now, on the Shang court side, on the tyrant side, on King Zhou side, this sudden loss of a vital defensive shield shocked him. It shocked the entire Shang court, into action. Now, however, with the eastern front being heavily pressured by the Dongyi people at this time, this was around the time of the third major campaign the Shang launched against the Dongyi. So the majority of the regulars, the trained military was tied down in the east. They could not move back west, just like that. And so they did the next best thing together with the existing forces defending the capital. They mobilized the entire city of the capital, they armed the criminals, they armed the slaves, and they threw them into the defenses of the city. Now, with the original regular defenses, the regular soldiers in defense, and maybe the militia and other people that they managed to raise from the populace, they basically managed to raise 530,000 fighting men, and about 170,000 slaves were armed by most accounts. And I seriously don't think this will have been accomplished within like a couple of days. I mean, if we were to follow this timeline of events, they said they crossed the Yellow River on the 21st, and then they reached Zhaoge on the 27th. I mean, I don't think you can raise 500,000 people in 5 days. Impossible. So this will have taken a period of time, most probably a couple of months, a year, maybe. So okay, now we assume that the Shang raised 700,000 fighting men over a period of time, maybe a few months or a year. Now we come back to the allied forces. Now, we mentioned that the Zhou army, that marched with King Wu, that came out of the state of Zhou itself, comprised of 300 chariots, 3,000 elites, and about 45,000 infantrymen. And then most people will say, okay, he marched out with 50,000 men. No, not exactly. Now, one point that most people miss is that a chariot unit is not just a war chariot with a driver, a spearman, and an archer. No, that's not a chariot unit. A single chariot unit of that time comprised of that war chariot with the archer, driver, and spearman, but also came with a complement of 72 footmen that followed the chariot. So just counting the Zhou forces alone with the 300 chariots, 45,000 infantry, and 3,000 elites, King Wu actually brought about 80,000 men with him from the state of Zhou itself. And by the accounts of the Grand Historian, the total number of fighting men that the allies brought was about 4,000 chariots. That's about 300,000 fighting men. Therefore, the disparity in numbers was not as great as most of us would believe. It was not 700,000 against 50,000. It was more like 700,000 versus 300 over 400,000. So with a roughly the odds of 1 to 2 fighting men, and the Zhou being better trained, better armed, and had much higher morale than the hastily raised mob on the Shang side, it's not really too far of a stretch to see that the Allied forces will be able to win this one. Now, assuming the invasion of Li happened somewhere late 1048 BC, it wouldn't be too far of a stretch to say that both sides took, a few months to rally troops and prepare for, the final showdown, the final conflict. And going by the norms of the times where major events and military actions mostly happen during the spring and autumn periods. So by the time King Wu and his lords and commanders returned to the front line, remember they went back to the Zhou capital for celebration, so by the time they returned to the front line, I would hazard to say that it's most probably around the autumn of 1047 BCE. That would make sense and fit in with the progress of events. Now that we know that the number of fighting men on both sides, number around 1 million fighting men in total on both sides, do you really think that this will be a battle that can be fought in one day? Practically impossible. That's my take on it, at least. What do you think? I don't think you can fight. I don't think 1 million people can fight on a battlefield, a single battlefield, in one day. It just defies logic. Now, this is where another misunderstanding of the nuances of language would trip up most people interested in this period. Now, we always talk about Battle of Muye, and we will all presume that Muye is a place. Well, today it is a place, but back then, 1046, 1047 BC, Muye does not refer to a specific place or location on the map. Instead, it was a general term used to describe an area outside of the walls of a city. The Mu and the Ye is basically an area outside the walls of any city, covering tens of kilometers of land. And so a correct understanding of the term Battle of Muye in this context would mean a battle or battles that took place outside the walls of Zhaoge, in the Muye of Zhaoge. That would be the more correct reading and understanding of this term. So now that we know that the number of fighting men numbers about 300,000 to 400,000 on one side and roughly 700,000 on the other side, and we know that the battlefield is not a singular place but a stretch or an area, and we know that the timeline would fit more logically if both sides had time to build up their forces in preparation for the final showdown. Now, would it be so far of a stretch to say that from the autumn of 1047 BC, Allied forces on the Zhou side started to push forward from Meng Jin towards Zhaoge, and over the next few months, from the most probably the entire autumn of 1047 BC to maybe early winter of 1047 BC, numerous bloody skirmishes and battles would take place between the two sides, and all of them will pay in blood for every single inch of ground that they either won or lost. And they will most probably take a short break through the harshness of the winter months, and the entire conflict culminated in the final showdown, which, as recorded by the grand historian or by other scholars as well, on the 27th day of the second month of 1046 BCE. That was not one single battle that decided everything, but it was the culmination of all the skirmishes and battles that had taken place, in the previous year. And this was the battle that finally broke whatever's left of the Shang forces and resulted in the fall of the capital Zhaoge and, of course, the demise of the Shang dynasty. And throughout this entire conflict on the Western Front, the elite forces of the Shang were still tied up on the Eastern Front, locked in a battle of attrition, most probably, with the Tongyi people. And they never made it back to the heartlands, never made it back to the heartlands of the Shang Kingdom, never made it back to the West. And to be very honest, this army that was in the East, they basically disappeared from the records of history. They basically were never spoken of again. And what I think happened was that, they had this battle attrition with the Tongyi people, and the remnants of the Tongyi and this Eastern army would easily have been swept up by the Zhou allied forces or the Zhou armies when they finally broke through and swept through the rest of the Shang Kingdom into the east. Now, that is a very, very possible series of events, at least in my mind. What do you think? And regarding this description in the book of documents, so much blood was shed that it could float logs. What I think happened was that, coupled with the early spring rains of 1046 BCE, the melting snow of the previous winter would flow, across the battlefield, carrying with it all the blood and the body parts and everything that was left behind through the months of battles that took place on these plains, about 50 to 100 square kilometers of 1,000 square kilometers of plains, where tens or hundreds of thousands of people, fighting men, will die on that battlefield. All the blood and everything that you can imagine, body parts, will be washed off and carried off by this early spring rain and the melting snow, and it would have formed this scene described in the book of documents as enough blood to float logs. So that's my take on what actually happened, in the final years of the Shang Dynasty, the final conflict between the Zhou and the Song. What do you think? Do you think I actually make some sense? Does my theory make sense? You think it holds water? Or do you think what's recorded by the grand historian actually made more sense? Let me know what you think, in the comment section below. This one, I'm really interested to know what you think. And if you got triggered by my theorizing and conjecture, I'm sorry, but like I say, don't use what I said in this video for your homework. It's not history, it's just purely my conjecture and what I think happened. Now, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give me a like, sub to the channel, comment on what you think, and share this video with everyone you know. And if you would like to support this channel even more, you can do so through Patreon. The link is available in the description box below, and I think there should be a screen now of my Patreon page, so you can check it out. What you can get by being a Patreon is early access to videos, at least for the time being, and more perks will come in the future. So yeah, I would really appreciate it. And these are our patrons, our current patrons of the channel, so thank you very much. And I guess that's it for today, and I'll see you, yes, you, correct, that's you beautiful people. I'll see you in the next episode.